Hi everyone, hope you're having a good day. Just want to read to you about a chap in the Bible, a guy called Omri from 1 Kings chapter 16. Just takes up 8 verses, 1 Kings 16 verses 21 to 28. But now the people of Israel were split into 2 factions. Half the people tried to make Tibni, son of Ginah, their king, while the other half supported Omri. But Omri's supporters defeated supporters of Tibni. So Tibni was killed and Omri became the next king. Omri began to rule over Israel in the 31st year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned 12 years in all, 6 of them in Tirzah. Then Omri bought the hill now known as Samaria from its owner Shema for 150 pounds of silver. He built a city on it and called the city Samaria in honor of Shema. But Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. He followed the example of Jeroboam son of Nebat and all the sins he had committed and led Israel to commit. The people provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, with their worthless idols. The rest of the events in Omri's reign, the extent of his power, and everything he did, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. When Omri died, he was buried in Samaria. Then his son Ahab became the next king. Just 8 verses and 12 years. That's all Omri reigned. Some of you may not have even heard of Omri. And from the biblical account, just those 8 verses, we may think he was a fairly obscure king who didn't do very much, and his reign was largely a failure. Well, other aspects of history would say otherwise. Omri is mentioned in other writings of the time and other inscriptions on our artifacts of the time. For example, the Moabite king, the Moabites, one of the neighbors of the Israelites, admits that they are subject to Omri, the king of Israel. He obviously had won some quite noticeable military victories in his time. He's also mentioned by none other than the superpower of the time, Assyria, who refer rather flatteringly to Israel as the land of Omri. He was, make no mistake about it, he was a man of renown. He was a man who brought prosperity, a certain amount of peace, which was hard to come by in those times, and also military prowess. He was a man of might, and he did, on the face of it, a lot of good in human terms for the land of Israel. Even much later on, a chap called Jehu, another notable leader of Israel, is referred to as again by the Assyrians as a son of Omri, which is actually nonsense. Jehu actually destroyed that dynasty, but it shows the regard with which Omri and his name were held. Omri also did something very important in Israel. He moved the capital halfway through his time as king and made the capital a place called Samaria, which was a very strategic fortress, very, very hard to take. It was the most successful and long-lasting capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom which Omri reigned over, the kingdom which actually had 10 of the 12 tribes within it. And Samaria was really the equivalent of Jerusalem. And in some ways, you could almost see Omri as the equivalent of David for his renown and his success in worldly terms. Later on, there'd be 2 other kings would be raised up called Jehoash and Jeroboam II. And these guys would again have great success. Jehoash actually took Jerusalem and he took the king of Judah captive. He got the closest during the divided kingdoms to actually unifying the kingdoms under his might and authority. His son Jeroboam II actually took Damascus off the Syrians, and was the Bible actually admits, again, these 2 guys don't get much in the Bible. The Bible is very short in its accounts of them, but the Bible does say that Jeroboam II was actually used to help his people out. So why does the Bible give such short shrift to these men who were successful and of renown, and at least in Jeroboam II's case, seem to be actually quite good for their people? The answer is in these few words. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And that primarily, of course, is what the Bible is concerned about. Are people rich toward God, or are they ignorant of him? And each of these guys didn't just sin themselves, they didn't just turn away from God, but they turned their nation away from God and caused the people to sin. They were a stumbling block in the relationship between the people of Israel, or Judah even, or of Israel, and God, the God that they were supposed to serve. And so their reigns are looked on in biblical terms, if not in worldly terms, as failures. These guys were men of great renown. As I say, they may have even done right by their people. Jeroboam II seems to have been a relatively good king as far as his people are concerned. Remember what Solomon asked for when God said, you can have anything. And Solomon said, I want wisdom. And the reason I need wisdom is I need to be wise about leading my people. I can't do it on my own. I want to lead for the good of my subjects. Don't we need leaders like that today? We could do with some of that, couldn't we? Leaders who actually will lead for the good of their subjects and not just their own ambition or for their own pride. But God wants even more than that. He wants them, and even indeed us, to be rich before him. Remember the story that Jesus told of the rich fool, a farmer who was very successful. I think he extended his lands, and he had a great crop harvest, so much so that he didn't have space in his barns. He was going to build bigger barns. But the indictment that Jesus uses on the man is he was not rich towards God. The legacy of Omri is, while he was used to bring prosperity to Israel, and his 12 years were actually very notable from what we can read in other sources. One of the biggest things he did, I would strongly assume, is this: in making a military and political alliance with a nation called Sidon and a king called Ethbal. I believe that Omri actually arranged a marriage between his son, who he obviously set up to be his successor as king, a guy called Ahab. And he made that marriage between Ahab and the daughter of Ethbal, king of the Sidonians, and her name, it's a byword for cruelty and wickedness, Jezebel. Omri set a series of events in place which would be the dark point of the kingdom, the dark point, the low point of the people of God. Ahab and his wife Jezebel did more of evil than any other king and queen. Jezebel hated God, and she hated the people who worshipped and served him and tried to exterminate them. And she was put in place effectively by her father-in-law, Omri. So although Omri's legacy in worldly terms may have been good, in spiritual terms, in God's economy, it was wicked. God doesn't just look about how successful we are, at how men and women, whether we're supported and loved by men and women. He looks on the heart and he asks the question, are you rich towards me? In the next 2 Sundays, we're going to be looking at our attitude to earthly rewards and our attitude to heavenly rewards, our attitude to whether we want to have the praise of people or the praise of God. And ultimately, we need to look to God for praise. Of course, we should do right by other people. They are God's created beings, and we're called to love our neighbour. But first of all, we're called to love our Lord with our heart, soul, mind and strength, to do what's right and to lead others to him, not away from him, but to lead others to him. May we be committed to that. May we remember our priority is to love the Lord who gave himself for us, who we owe our very existence to. And we owe the fact that we have a relationship with him and we have an eternal destination which we ultimately look to for rewards, not the short-term rewards of this life. May you know God's blessing through this day, through this week, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. God bless.